Major support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Colonial Life, providing benefits to employees to help them protect their family, their finances, and their futures. High Point University, the premier life skills university, focused on preparing students for the world as it is going to be. And Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Our politics used to be seasonal. Remember, we wouldn't hear much about it unless and until we started to close in on regular local, state, and national elections. Welcome again to the most widely watched source of Carolina business policy and public affairs. It is not overstating that our politics now are 24/7, 365. There are cable channels, blogs, social sites, radio programs, group chats, radio stations, subscriber services, private user messaging, etc., solely committed to ginning political debate. Much of this will reach a fever pitch this year, no surprise, and it's not just about the RNC in Charlotte or the presidential contest. We'll start our dialogue in just a moment, and more than just about politics, with an expert panel, and later on, a current poll, and former Republican North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory joins us again.
Gratefully acknowledging support by Martin Marietta, a leading provider of natural resource-based building materials, providing the foundation upon which our communities improve and grow. Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, an independent licensee of the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association. Visit us at southcarolinablues.com. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. BARINGS, a leading global asset management firm dedicated to meeting the evolving investment and capital needs of its clients. Learn more at barings.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Jeff Ruble from Richland County Economic Development, Dr. Mark Gabriel Little from CREATE of the UNC Kenan Institute, and special guest, former North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory.
Hello and welcome again to our program, Dr. Little. Welcome back, Mr. Ruble. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. You want to talk about Carolina sports at all? Would that be an appropriate place to start?
It would not.
No chance. I think that's better left at sleeping dogs left. But seriously, so let me ask you a broad question, both of you. Here we are in the 11th year of an economic expansion. Budgets are flush. South Carolina's got a $1.8 billion surplus. North Carolina's had a surplus for a couple of years. If we can't, and these are my words, Mark, but if we can't address things like education, public policy, health care, if we can't do it when the economy's good, then what's your biggest fear when it slows down?
Well, I think you spoke to it directly. We have the funds to address those things now. When the economy turns, which it will inevitably, we won't have those funds, and we'll be just trying to patch up in places that we can. So I think it's always difficult when things are going well, when you have low unemployment, everything seems fine to make those kinds of decisions, but this really is when those decisions have to be made.
So, not to put words in your mouth, but you say because people don't feel the immediacy of we've got to do it now because things are so good that it lacks some type of heat or light? It
lacks some type of heat and light, absolutely. Yeah.
Jeff, how do you come down on that?
You know, it seems like one of the trends we're seeing that we need to be preparing for, in economic development, we always measure projects by capital investment and jobs. It seems like we'll cut a deal with a company, and every time, or invariably, they'll come back to us with less jobs and more investment. So the trend is a way every company, whether manufacturing or white collar, increasingly are automating. They're doing more with less people. So the demand, it seems, in the future is going to be toward creating a workforce that trends toward the demand for smarter tech-based workers. And both states, South Carolina and North Carolina, I think are kind of struggling to get there. How do we create that workforce?
You know, let's stay on this idea of economic development, not just because you brought it up, Jeff, but there's a pithy subcategory of economic development, and I might not even be giving it the credit it's due, but it's called inclusive economic development. Dr. Little, what is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in terms of how it's framed in the world right now as pithy, small. Really, the way I think about it is, if you want to develop an economy, you want to have people who are engaged in that economy benefiting from that economy. And so, if you look, since we were talking earlier, since 1979, not even just the last 11 years, since 1979, the economy's done great. Mm-hmm. But wages for the median person in America are flat. So what that means is the economy's doing really well, but a lot of people are not included in that economic benefit. And so whether it's because people are in rural places, because people are employed in jobs where they're being automated, the number of people in America broadly, not just North and South Carolina, that are not benefiting from the economy year over year, decade over decade, is increasing and increasing and increasing. And so the importance of really thinking about how do we develop an economy that employs people who want employment, that gives them a pathway through education or other means to get those jobs, that will pay them a wage, that will allow them to have the agency in their life that they want. That's what I think of when I think of inclusive economic development. And
okay. So does in South Carolina's example then, Jeff, does South Carolina Commerce, does that give you another tool? Is it, I don't mean to say it this way, is it just a kind of a snappy little title, or is there some deeper strategy around inclusive economic development?
Boy, it's just a tough challenge. You know, for years, the way we've approached it is we just bring in wealth, and the thought was the rising tide lifts all boats.
Right.
Clearly, you're hearing that it doesn't. So it's a tough challenge. I think probably one of the keys is lining up better workforce development and economic development. So not just creating the jobs, but making sure that workforce is prepared for those jobs so that everybody can take advantage.
So let me press you on that a little bit. Dan Elsie was here, head of Department of Employment and Workforce in South Carolina, and he was talking about the same thing. But we hear that over and over from policy folks, from leadership. But what does that really mean? It would seem like workforce and economic development are joined at the hip, or joined at the shoulder, or joined at the base of the skull. Is that not the case?
You'd like to think so. I think it's an ongoing struggle.
Really?
Both states, probably nationally too.
Why? Yeah. That seems like a natural.
So we were also talking about this a little bit earlier as well. One of the issues is everyone has a job. Everyone has a job title, a thing they're focused on. They're focused on workforce development. They see wins there. They're focused on economic development. They say, we can get 100 million CapEx. This company comes in, we have a win. Taking a step back on the state level, on the regional level, on the country level, actually, how do you organize these systems so they're actually working together? So in our work in rural North Carolina, rural South Carolina, you see it, a small place that has these divisions that have been there for decades, community college that does various things,
right.
Economic development does various things, not necessarily connected, and the community just kind of out of the loop completely and not knowing where to engage, how to engage, K through 12 not knowing how to engage, where to engage. But like you were saying earlier, there's going to be a downturn that comes, and if we don't think about these things as systems that really need to be working together, planning together, then we're going to have a problem.
Let me ask you two just quick questions, state specific. In North Carolina, there's a lot of talk from not just NC Rural, but a lot of folks about this, that broadband, wide deployment of broadband in every 100 county in North Carolina would go a long way to cover that gap that you talk about the connectivity. Do you believe that broadband is a big answer to a question?
So broadband is infrastructure to me. Broadband is like water, sewer. You can mismanage water, sewer. You can, it is just something that has to be there. We should have done it 10 years ago. So we're way behind the ball on broadband.
But Mark, would that be a huge step forward?
It would be helpful, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It would not solve the problem, though. It would not solve the problem between disconnectedness between workforce development, K through 12, economic development.
Okay. South Carolina's talked a lot in this session, not just the General Assembly, but the whole idea that that they need to, and this is my term, they need to catch up to North Carolina when it came to tax reform. Does the Palmetto State hold the Tar Heel State out as an example and are using that as a blueprint to some degree?
Absolutely. Well, every time we compete state to state, you kill us on property taxes. Our property taxes are some of the highest in the country. Sort of like Mark was just saying, we should have done this 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Tax reform is absolutely necessary. I wish they could do it this year.
Do you think they'll get it? How would you handicap that they're going to get it done, Jeff?
I'm not holding my breath.
Okay, all right.
I'd love for it to happen, though.
Gentlemen, thank you. Please stay with us. We'll bring our guest on in a moment. Coming up on our show, they are both two separate shows, but they're both the chief law enforcement officers in the states. First, Josh Stein, the Attorney General of North Carolina, will join us again on this program, talking about everything from opioids to political issues, as well as South Carolina's Attorney General Alan Wilson comes back too. He will also be talking about those things that seem to be bubbling to the top in the Palmetto State. Our guest is a Guilford County, North Carolina native. Notable achievements include the youngest elected mayor and the longest serving mayor, 7 terms at the mayor of the city of Charlotte. Also, he was the first mayor of the Carolinas' largest city to go on to become North Carolina's governor. He served as Republican governor in North Carolina from 2013 to 2017. We welcome again to this program the Honorable Pat McCrory. Governor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Chris.
Nice to see you, sir. I want to ask you a question that has gotten us to this point about our politics, about civility. You've had your share of opponents while you were in office, both as mayor but also governor. Does character matter?
I think character still does matter, and it can influence an election by several thousand or tens of thousands of votes at the local, state, and federal level. But there are 2 other factors that are also influencing many voters. There's character, there's policy, and there's results. And sometimes some voters will sacrifice character if they agree with the policy or they agree with the results. And we see that at the national level for sure. A president who I support cusses, and it makes me feel very uncomfortable. The Speaker of the House tears up a document of the speech, which we've never seen in the House chambers in my lifetime, something like that. And if you're on either side, you make an exception for that because you agree with the policy or the results of the person who might be contradicting the characters that you agree with or disagree with. So we tend to compromise on certain items in order to support the leader of our choice, and that sometimes happens also in the private sector.
When you were across the table from folks that either didn't agree with HB 2, didn't agree with the I-77 plan, that your transportation, didn't agree when you were mayor of Charlotte about a light rail that's turned out to be a pretty successful investment. How did you not make that personal? How did you keep it as a respectful debate?
Where the disrespectful debate occurs is not in private meetings you have with people who agree or disagree with you, whether it be with state legislators or even your opponent. Your opponent usually understands these are tough decisions. They're usually a 51-49 decisions. They aren't black and white decisions. Any of those issues were not black and white decisions. They were extremely complex decisions. Where you have where it gets personal is how the media portrays it, or how commercials portray it, or how third-party groups or even protesters portray it, when it's obvious that they are putting a message out there that does not show the complexity of what often are very complex issue, whether it be dealing with toll lanes, whether it be dealing with a budget, or whether it be dealing with a social issue. Almost every social issue that a politician gets involved in is much more complex than the interest groups that are promoting either for or against those social issues.
Dr. Little, question?
Yeah, so great to be able to speak with you. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the transition from being perceived as a kind of a moderate mayor, and then having a state legislature that may be perceived as being more conservative than you, and how that how did you handle that transition, if you saw it as a transition, and just any advice that you might have to other folks out there that within their party are dealing with those kinds of extremes, let's say.
I think actually most of what you read was more of a branding of who's conservative and who's liberal. And again, most of my discussions with both Republican legislators and Democratic legislators, there was not much difference. It was usually a discussion of the complex issue of, do you expand Medicaid or do you not expand Medicaid? It's not whether you're for or against. It's one of the most complex subjects that you can deal with, because there are so many ramifications financially at the local, state, and federal level that are involved in that decision making. But the way it's portrayed in the public is a simple, very simple issue. Where I found most of the conflicts in Raleigh, and at times when I was mayor, was not a difference in philosophy, even with my own power, with my own job. It was a power struggle. I even had to, when I was governor, most people forget that I sued my own Republican legislature and took them to the Supreme Court and won that lawsuit. I paid for it politically in future dynamics and relationships with my Republican legislature, because I actually took them to court. And I took them to court out of a balance of power dispute, which you're seeing now in Washington, D.C. between the executive branch and Congress, right? Even on the War Powers Act. It's the gray area of who has the power to make a tough decision, for example, in Iran. It has to do with the executive branch power versus the judicial branch power versus the legislative branch power. So it's interesting, whether it's Republican or Democrats, even within your own party, many of the disputes behind the scenes are about power and turf. Thank God that never happens in the private sector.
Yeah, I'm sure. Jeff?
So it's a human dynamic. So that was my biggest challenge, were the power struggles of who has the authority to get something done.
Chris was just talking about some of the things you accomplished while you were mayor. Looking back on those 7 terms, what are you most, I guess, proud of?
Probably 3 areas. One is deciding to expand the airport very early on, and back in 1994, 95, 96 period, where I also have to give my predecessor, Richard Van Root, where we knew we had to continue to build the 3rd parallel runway. By the way, it was completed 3 months after I left office. My successor got all the credit for it, did the ribbon cutting, but it was a smart move. The second is probably the light rail line and the transportation plan. And the third is how we converted what used to be housing projects into living communities free of crime. And I'm very, very proud of that work we did as mayor. But I took a lot of that work to the governor's office too, and implemented a 50-year transportation plan of connecting the rural areas with the large urban centers. And I hope we don't stop that plan. I'm also very proud of the tax reform in North Carolina that I think will have positive ramifications for a long, long time. And you can see it. A lot of people predicted when I signed tax reform that we'd have a budget deficit. We're getting more revenue in than we've ever had before, which helps with teacher pay raises and other infrastructure needs.
Would you hope, woulda, coulda, shoulda, but would you hope that North Carolina, while you were in the governor's mansion, but also now, that North Carolina would make a bigger investment in education? What's holding us back on that?
Well, we're actually making a huge investment in education. It's the majority of our budget if you include secondary universities, community colleges, and K through 12. I mean, it's the largest part of our budget. I think part of the problem we're having in education at all 3 levels in both North and South Carolina is accountability and efficiency. I'm very concerned right now for the next generation, the Generation Z, who are going into debt by hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a 4-year college degree. I think in the future, if I were still in charge, I'd be working on re-engineering all of our universities and maybe even questioning, why does it take 4 years to get a college education? Why are we taking summers off? I mean, that goes back to the agricultural period of the 1800s. We've taken summers off and people are going in debt, paying off that debt while waiting for 3 months to go back to class. It makes no sense. So I think our universities, especially our community colleges, are doing a real good job, and our universities are doing great jobs, but they have got to become more efficient. Their costs are increasing 9 to 10% a year when our inflation is 2 or 3%. And that's not fair to the students of today, signing and going in debt. Is something you and I didn't have to do.
Is student debt a bubble?
Student debt is obviously a bubble.
Will it pop?
We've got presidential candidates right now promising to forgive billions of dollars of student debt. Well, someone else is going to have to incur that cost. And student debt is also, I think, going to have a long-term impact on the housing market, where new students were, after I was out of college for 2 or 3 years, I got out of my apartment and bought a house because I didn't have student debt. Now they're going to have to stay in the apartments, the rental housing, longer. And I think that could have a big influence on future home ownership, which was a major goal of politicians in the 1990s.
Mark, question?
So just following up on the student debt piece, and so in community colleges and workforce development, if you maybe talk a little bit more about that sort of vision about what that might look like. We were talking earlier about the need for developing more agile education system. So what does that look like, K through 12, but also, you mentioned
I think
higher ed.
we're going to get away from the concept of degrees, both for business recruiters, which I used to be recruitment manager at Duke Energy Company. I think we're going to get into the concept of what are you certified to do, as opposed to a general degree.
And Google, for example, they've changed their hiring now, so they don't even really look whether you graduated from college. It's like, what are the skills that you have?
The head of Microsoft and the head of Facebook never graduated from college either, but they became an expert. And I'm not saying a degree isn't bad, but I think the universities are going to have to reinvent themselves and go, is there a certification process where I could become a programmer or other types of very specific needs that industry now needs in North Carolina and throughout the nation. And I think the state that reinvents its universities in the future will be the state that will lead economic development decades from now, as opposed to incurring this debt that not only the students have, but taxpayers have, because we have unfunded liabilities in both North and South Carolina. The unfunded liability of pension programs and of health care for university employees and all state employees in North Carolina is about $30 billion. Unfunded liabilities. We just had a major newspaper chain that's going under Chapter 11 because of unfunded pension liability. McClatchy newspaper, that's nothing compared to state government at this point in time, and sooner or later that bubble is going to hit us too. And so if I were in charge right now, I'd look at how can we re-engineer all these programs to help our students, because there's no way students and parents of students will be able to afford this down the road. It's not fair to them.
Jeff?
Before you joined us, we were talking about economic inclusion, economic justice. I know in just about every state, there's always pressure for the rural counties to get more economic development. In North Carolina, I know the criticism always has been that the majority of the investments focused on 2 counties, Mecklenburg and Wake. What did you do when you were governor? Did you have strategies, and were they successful?
My biggest strategy, which I hope will continue to be promoted, is what I called Connect North Carolina through infrastructure and through technology. And so the Roxboroughs of North Carolina could connect with Durham. The Wadesboroughs outside of Charlotte connect with Charlotte. And Wadesboroughs, very high unemployment for today's time. Basically no unemployment in Charlotte, but still high unemployment and low wages in Wadesboro. How can we connect through transportation, through the internet, through technology, getting internet in all of our rural schools? So I called it Connect NC. And I started it, by the way. I failed in my transportation bonds. It was taken out, but we had university bonds and community college bonds and park bonds. But part of the university bonds was all new investments in universities go through science and technical buildings, because that's where we have a shortage of employers right now. And a lot of those universities, like Western Carolina, Pembroke, Elizabeth State University, are areas and schools that are having a tough time recruiting new students. East Carolina is having a problem right now. But if we build good science and engineering schools there, then they have a choice to rebuild, and then some of those students will stay in the rural areas, especially those in medicine and healthcare, which to me is our biggest challenge in state governments, is the addiction and mental health care issue.
Well, Dr. Mandy Cohen,
terrible.
Dr. Cohen from DHHS has made a point of that. We've got a minute and a half left, and speaking of health and human services, North Carolina still does not have an approved state budget. DHHS was going to make a major change beginning February 1st around how they were going to pay for Medicaid. Yeah. That is tabled. How much of a risk is that, given what you just talked about? not having a budget, not having...
It's a terrible risk. The healthcare system in our nation and in our two states is still broken. We're treading water at this point in time. Aldona Voss, who by the way is now hopefully going to be ambassador to Canada, she had to close, when I became governor, a $500 million deficit in Medicaid spending. We not only closed it, making some very difficult and controversial decisions, but we now have a surplus. But that surplus is, I'm afraid Medicaid costs are going to go in debt again, which will, Medicaid was originally, for the elderly, the young, the disabled. And if that starts going underwater again, we're in trouble.
We're out of time, Governor, but thank you for coming back on the program. I can't even count the times, but it's great to have you, and thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Chris.
Jeff, good to see you.
Thank you, Chris.
Dr. Little, go Carolina.
Go Carolina.
For your benefit.
Thank you.
Until next week, I'm Chris Whitting. We hope your weekend is good. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review provided by High Point University, Martin Marietta, Colonial Life, the Duke Endowment, BARINGS, Grant Thornton, Sunoco, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, and by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.